Hello everyone. Today, we're going to explore about one of the world's most important military alliances, NATO, and the challenges it has faced since the end of the Cold War. By the end of this video, you'll understand what NATO is, why it was created, and why it continues to play an important role in today's world. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was established in 1949, shortly after World War II. At that time, many countries in Europe were worried about the growing influence of the Soviet Union. To protect themselves, 12 countries came together and signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO. Today, NATO has grown into one of the world's strongest military alliances, with more than 30 member countries from Europe and North America. The foundation of NATO is Article 5, also known as the principle of collective defense. This means that if one NATO member is attacked, all the other members will help defend that country. Think of it like a group of close friends. If one friend is being bullied, the others step in to help. NATO works in a similar way, except it involves countries working together to protect one another. During the Cold War, NATO had one clear mission: to prevent the Soviet Union from threatening or attacking its member countries. However, everything changed in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War officially ended. This raised an important question. If NATO was created to stop the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union no longer existed, did NATO still have a purpose? That question became the first major challenge NATO had to face after the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, NATO faced its first major challenge, an identity crisis. An identity crisis happens when a person or an organization begins to question its purpose. For NATO, this happened because its main enemy, the Soviet Union, no longer existed. Imagine a firefighter whose main job is putting out fires. If there are suddenly no more fires, people might start asking, do we still need firefighters? The firefighters would then need to find new ways to serve the community. NATO experienced something similar. For more than 40 years, NATO's main mission had been to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union. But after 1991, many people believed NATO had completed its mission and should be dissolved. Instead of ending the alliance, NATO decided to transform itself. It expanded its role beyond traditional military defense and took on new responsibilities. One of these was peacekeeping, which involves helping countries maintain peace after a conflict. Another was crisis management, where NATO responds to international crises before they become larger problems. NATO also became involved in humanitarian missions, helping protect civilians during conflicts and supporting relief efforts. Later, NATO took on an important role in counterterrorism, especially after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. These new responsibilities can be seen in several missions. In Bosnia, NATO helped end violence and support peace. In Kosovo, it worked to prevent further humanitarian suffering. In Afghanistan, NATO led its largest mission to combat terrorism and help rebuild the country. These operations showed that NATO had successfully adapted to a changing world. However, taking on more responsibilities also made NATO's mission much broader and more complex. Member countries sometimes disagreed on where NATO should become involved and what its priorities should be. So, although NATO overcame its identity crisis by adapting to new challenges, this transformation also created new questions about its future role in global security. After solving its identity crisis, NATO faced another major challenge: its own expansion. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many countries in Eastern Europe became independent. These countries wanted greater security, democracy, and stability after many years under Soviet influence. As a result, many of them applied to join NATO. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. Later, countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Bulgaria also became NATO members. For these countries, joining NATO meant protection. Under Article 5, they knew that if they were attacked, the other NATO members would help defend them. However, Russia saw NATO's expansion very differently. Imagine your neighbor keeps building taller fences and adding more security cameras closer and closer to your house. Even if they say it's only for their own protection, you might still feel uneasy or threatened. Russia felt the same way. As NATO expanded eastward, the alliance moved closer to Russia's borders. Russia believed this expansion threatened its national security and reduced the distance between NATO forces and Russian territory. As trust between both sides decreased, tensions continued to rise. These tensions became more serious over time. In 2008, Russia fought a war with Georgia. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Then, in 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, creating the biggest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Although many factors contributed to these conflicts, NATO's expansion remains one of the main issues dividing NATO and Russia. This challenge teaches us an important lesson in international relations. While NATO's expansion made many Eastern European countries feel safer, it also made Russia feel less secure. In other words, one country's effort to improve its own security can sometimes make another country feel threatened. This is why NATO's expansion continues to be one of the alliance's biggest post-Cold War challenges. After the Cold War, NATO faced a new type of threat. Instead of preparing for wars between countries, it now had to deal with terrorism. Unlike a country's army, terrorist groups do not have clear borders, military bases, or large armies. They often operate secretly in different parts of the world, making them much harder to identify and stop. The biggest turning point came on 11 September 2001, also known as 9/11. On that day, terrorists from the group Al-Qaeda hijacked passenger airplanes and carried out attacks in the United States, killing thousands of innocent people. For the first time in NATO's history, Article 5 was activated. This meant that the attack on the United States was considered an attack on all NATO members. Together, NATO launched a mission in Afghanistan to fight terrorism, destroy terrorist networks, and help rebuild the country. This became NATO's largest and longest military operation, lasting almost 20 years. Although NATO achieved some success, terrorism remains a global challenge because terrorist groups can easily move across borders and often hide among civilians. Another important challenge is burden sharing. Burden sharing refers to how NATO members share the responsibility of defending the alliance. NATO encourages every member country to spend at least 2% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense. However, not every country spends the same amount. The United States spends much more on defense than many other NATO members. Imagine a group project where one student does most of the work, while everyone else contributes very little. Eventually, that student may feel the situation is unfair. The same issue exists within NATO. For many years, the United States argued that some European members were relying too heavily on American military protection instead of investing more in their own defense. Although many countries have increased their defense spending in recent years, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, burden sharing remains an important challenge because a strong alliance depends on every member contributing fairly. As NATO continued to grow, another major challenge emerged: maintaining unity among its members. Today, NATO has more than 30 member countries, and each country has its own national interests and security priorities. For example, countries such as Poland and the Baltic states see Russia as their biggest security concern because they are located close to Russia. Meanwhile, countries in Southern Europe are often more concerned about issues such as migration, terrorism, and instability in nearby regions. This means that NATO members do not always agree on what the alliance should focus on. One of NATO's key principles is consensus. This means that important decisions are made only when all member countries agree. Every country, regardless of its size, has an equal voice. This system helps ensure fairness and cooperation, but it also makes decision-making slower. When members have different priorities, reaching an agreement can take time and require compromise. Another growing challenge for NATO is cybersecurity. Today, wars are no longer fought only with soldiers, tanks, or missiles. Countries can also be attacked through computers and the internet. These attacks are called cyber attacks. Cyber attacks can target important systems such as electricity networks, banks, government websites, hospitals, and military communications. Instead of causing physical destruction, they can disrupt daily life and damage a country's economy and security. One famous example occurred in Estonia in 2007, when a series of cyber attacks disrupted government services, banks, and media organizations. This incident showed that cyber attacks can seriously affect a country without a single soldier crossing its borders. One of the biggest challenges is that cyber attacks are difficult to trace. It is often hard to identify who is responsible, making it more complicated for NATO to decide how to respond. As technology continues to develop, protecting digital systems has become just as important as protecting national borders. This is why cybersecurity is now one of NATO's top priorities. The next challenge facing NATO is the rise of China. When NATO was established in 1949, its main focus was Europe and the Soviet Union. China was not considered a major security concern at that time. However, over the past few decades, China has become one of the world's largest economies and a major military power. It has invested heavily in advanced technology, cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, and modern weapons. Although NATO does not consider China an enemy, it recognizes that China's growing influence could affect global security. As a result, NATO has started strengthening its partnerships with countries in the Indo-Pacific region, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. This shows that NATO's attention is no longer limited to Europe, but also extends to wider global security issues. Another major challenge is the Russia-Ukraine war. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, creating the biggest conflict in Europe since the Second World War. Many people wondered whether NATO would directly join the war. The answer is no, because Ukraine is not a NATO member. This means Article 5 does not apply. However, NATO has provided significant support to Ukraine by supplying military equipment, training Ukrainian soldiers, sharing intelligence, and delivering humanitarian aid. At the same time, NATO has been careful not to send its own troops into Ukraine, as this could lead to a direct war with Russia, a country that possesses nuclear weapons. This shows how NATO must carefully balance supporting Ukraine while avoiding a larger international conflict. Conclusion. To conclude, the end of the Cold War did not mark the end of NATO. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Today, NATO faces many different challenges, including finding a new purpose, expanding its membership, fighting terrorism, strengthening cybersecurity, maintaining unity, responding to the rise of China, and managing the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. As the world continues to change, one important question remains: can NATO remain united and continue adapting to an increasingly complex world?